Days attack on Pearl Harbor, Germany and Italy declared war against the United States as they were allied with Japan. This would probably prove to be Hitler's final fatal blunder, as Germany did not have to declare war on the United States. FDR and Churchill agreed to focus on Germany first, as the United States would likely be the one concentrating on Japan, and they were in the midst of a salvage operation to recover from the attack at Pearl Harbor. The plan was to initiate an economic blockade against both Germany and Italy, then to begin air attacks on Germany, to launch peripheral strikes in the Mediterranean, and then to begin a final direct assault on Germany itself. A significant campaign for the Allies was the one in North Africa called Operation Torch, led by General Dwight Eisenhower beginning in November of 1942. More than 100,000 Allied troops invaded North Africa in Algeria and Morocco, resulting in a major victory at the Battle of El Alamein, and it would ultimately end Nazi presence in North Africa. From there, the United States could begin planning its invasion of Europe, targeting the so-called soft underbelly, Sicily and Italy itself. The invasion of Italy would be commanded by General George Patton, with British and American forces landing on Sicily in July of 1943. Within a month, the island had been captured. Mussolini had also been forced out of power by officials within the Fascist Party and was on the run. Allied forces then began their slow and steady march towards Rome, which they ultimately occupied by June of 1944. To prepare for a main invasion of Europe, long-range bombers were launched from North Africa and southern Italy, targeting Germany's industrial centers. These long-range bombers often suffered tremendous casualties, as fighter aircraft could not fly far enough to escort them. But they did the damage that was necessary to weaken Germany at a critical moment in the war. There were several attempts at diplomacy during the war, with the leaders of the Big Three, Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin, meeting to discuss various issues that had come up. At Casablanca in January of 43, FDR and Churchill agreed on a policy of unconditional surrender for all enemies in the war, and they also agreed to focus on Italy first, before opening up a second front in France, something that Stalin was desperate to have occur ever since the Battle of Stalingrad, which had caused the Nazi forces to begin to retreat. But at that point, Stalin felt that the Soviet Union had been bearing the full brunt of Nazi attacks. At the Tehran Conference later in 1943, the Allies began to plan the invasion of Western Europe, opening up that second front, effectively planning D-Day. At that conference, Stalin promised that the Soviet Union would at some point enter the war against Japan. And they even began to discuss slightly what they hoped the post-war world would look like, and it's here that disputes began to occur. Operation Overlord, the one that was planned at the Tehran Conference, is perhaps the war's most important battle. It was commanded by General Dwight Eisenhower. Although before the invasion itself, Allied intelligence went to great lengths to trick the Axis powers into thinking that the invasion was going to come elsewhere, further to the east at Calais, as opposed to Normandy. They even went so far as to create a fictitious invading army to keep the defenses in Normandy as weak as possible. The Allies prepared for the invasion by purposely bombing areas well outside of the target zone and focused on cutting supply lines and communication lines connecting Germany to northern France. Bad weather kept the invasion force in England for another day. But once launched, this would become the largest amphibious assault in world history to this point. Shortly after midnight on June 6, 1944, approximately 120,000 troops left England and landed at 5 beachheads along the Normandy coast. Some faced minimal opposition. Others faced tremendous coastal defenses. 2 beaches would be invaded by American troops, 2 by British troops, and 1 by Canadians. The Americans were assigned to both Utah and Omaha Beach, and at Omaha Beach the invading forces faced the fiercest opposition, as the pre-invasion attacks had taken out virtually none of the coastal defenses. It is here that the worst casualties of D-Day would occur. But by nightfall the vast majority of the troops had landed, opening up a hole in the Axis line, which then allowed millions of troops to pour into northern France. The Allies failed. Hitler could have focused on the Eastern Front and perhaps even negotiated an end to the war with Stalin, which would have left most of Europe under Nazi control. Instead, Allied troops began the slow process of forcing Nazis out of France. In one final counteroffensive, Germany conducted what became known as the Battle of the Bulge. He tried to push back against an invasion of Germany itself. But the Allies pushed back, and as the United States and Britain grew closer, they began attacking German cities such as Dresden with firebombs, destroying factories and rail lines, killing more than 100,000 people, to disrupt the Nazi war machine. Of course, many of the dead were civilians. With the Battle of the Bulge a failure, US and British forces approached Berlin from the west, as the Soviets closed in from the east. In addition, German resistance in Italy was collapsing, and Mussolini was caught by the Italian resistance and killed. Hitler eventually retreated out of Berlin into a private bunker and committed suicide on April 30th. Just days later, on May 7, 1945, Germany agreed to an unconditional surrender, and the following day, VE Day was celebrated. But in the Pacific, things were a lot different. After the attack of Pearl Harbor, the Japanese saw tremendous success, taking Guam, Wake Island, Hong Kong, Singapore, Burma, the Dutch East Indies, and the Philippines, more than 1 million square miles of territory. For the United States, the loss of the Philippines was particularly catastrophic. 20,000 U.S. troops, led by General Douglas MacArthur, had withdrawn from Manila to the Bataan Peninsula, but were eventually forced to surrender. MacArthur was ordered by Washington to leave secretly for Australia, leaving many of his troops behind, though he promised to return. For the U.S. troops that remained, though, they were marched some 85 miles, what is known as the Bataan Death March, along which they were tortured, beaten, and starved. After so many defeats, the United States needed some sort of victory. In April of 1942, that victory came, though it was not announced for more than a year. American Army bombers under the command of Colonel James Doolittle executed what was actually a militarily insignificant raid on the Japanese home islands, but in direct retaliation for Pearl Harbor. It's insignificant because the United States only had 16 planes, compared to the several hundred that Japan had used in their attack. But bombs were dropped on various targets, and even though all 16 planes were lost, the raid served as a rallying point and encouraged both the American leadership, American troops, and the American public once it became known. The key result of this small-scale raid was that Japan was forced to withdraw some of its troops from offensive action in order to defend their home islands. And as it turned out, the United States didn't lose a battle afterwards. Several significant battles occurred in the Pacific campaigns of the war, including the Battle of the Coral Sea in May of 1942, which is significant in that it was fought entirely with aircraft, showing the new direction of naval warfare.